Micro-cheating simply means secret activities or behaviors carried out in relationships. When people hear the word micro-cheating, the first direction their mind might go to is that one partner is sleeping with someone outside the relationship. But that's not what we're talking about here. We're talking about the space between loyalty and betrayal, where nothing looks serious on the surface, but something quietly changes underneath. It's not about the physical infidelity, it's about the subtle behaviors that create emotional distance. Private conversations that feels a little too personal, attention given where it shouldn't be, moments that are hidden, minimized, or explained away. And what makes this so difficult to confront is that it rarely comes with a clear evidence. There is no single moment you can point out and say, this is where it broke. Instead, it shows up as a feeling, a hesitation, and a question you can't fully justify, but can't ignore either. You start noticing small things that quietly doesn't add up. The tone changes, you feel a little less included, a little more uncertain. Every time you try to make sense of it, it gets brushed off as nothing. At the end of the day, this leads to a reaction, not from one moment, but a compounded pattern your mind is trying to piece together. Because micro-cheating doesn't damage your relationship in obvious ways, it creates emotional ambiguity. It makes you question what you're seeing, what you're feeling, and eventually what you can trust. Not just in your partner, but in yourself. What ends up happening is that you don't just lose trust all at once, you lose it in moments so small that they almost feel ridiculous to question. A phone placed face down, a notification that disappears just a little too quickly, a name you don't recognize but is followed by a heart emoji. And when you ask about it, the answers comes fast, almost rehearsed. Answers like, it's nothing, it's just a joke, you're overthinking it. But there's the part that doesn't make sense. Why does something that lasts just 2 seconds feels like you weigh so much? Why does a single like, a single message, a single hidden interaction sit in your chest like something much bigger is wrong, even when you can't prove anything is? That's the paradox most people get stuck in. Because what you're reacting to is not just the action, the pattern your brain is quietly trying to piece together. Trust doesn't just automatically break in a loud, dramatic moment. It doesn't shatter like glass. It drains slowly and quietly, like a leak you can't see but can definitely feel. And today, we're going to look at this through the lens most people never apply to relationships, which is behavioral economics. Because trust, whether people realize it or not, behaves a lot like money. You don't lose everything in one bad decision, you lose it through 1,000 small withdrawals that you barely notice at the time. And what makes this even more complicated is that the person making those withdrawals often doesn't believe that you're doing something wrong. That's where this idea of micro-cheating lives, not in the obvious betrayals, but in the gray areas, the spaces where nothing is technically happening, but something definitely feels off. It's not about having a full-blown affair. It's a late-night conversation that just feel a little bit too personal. It's the inside jokes with someone that you're not part of. It's keeping tabs on an ex, not because you want them back, but because you don't just fully want to let go either. It's a subtle shift in your emotional energy, where pieces of intimacy that used to belong inside the relationship start leaking outside of it. And most important part is not the behavior in isolation, it's the intent behind it. It's the secrecy around it, where that emotional energy usually goes. There's something in psychology called displacement principle. It's simple, but uncomfortable. Your attention and your emotional investment in relationship is limited. This is sad, but true whether you like it or not. It's a finite resource. So when you start spending that energy somewhere else, you're not creating more of it, but taking it away from somewhere. Think about it like this. Imagine someone comes home after a long day, they barely talk, they seem distracted, but later that night, you see them laughing at their phones, fully engaged, typing fast. That energy didn't come from nowhere, it was there all along. It just wasn't given to you. This is where micro-cheating quietly does its damage. It's not by adding something new, but by subtracting something essential. There's a concept borrowed from finance and cybersecurity called salami slicing. It's the idea that you can take something significant, but do it in such small pieces that not a single action feels serious enough to trigger alarm. That's exactly how micro-cheating operates. Not a single message feels like betrayal, no single like feels like cheating, no single conversation feels like crossing the line. But stack them up together over days, weeks, months, or even years, and you've created something that feels very real. And the reason it continues is because it allows the person doing it to protect their self-image. They don't feel like they're cheating. They still see themselves as loyal, because in their minds, nothing big has happened. Psychologists call this the moral decoupling, which is separating your actions from your identity. It's gonna sound like I'm a good partner, so it can't be that bad. But underneath all that, there's usually something deeper driving the behavior. A lot of people who engage in micro-cheating aren't just chasing attention, they're managing insecurity. They're building what could be a validation reserve. It's like an emotional backup system, because them fully relying emotionally on one person, which is supposed to be their primary partner in this case, can feel risky. So instead of putting all that emotional weight into one connection, they spread it out, just enough to feel safe. Then when something goes wrong in the relationship, instead of sitting in that discomfort and working through it, they go somewhere else for that quick hit of reassurance and a safe space, just for a message, a compliment, or a reminder that they're still wanted. And it works, but just temporarily. And there's a cost to that shortcut, because every time emotional energy is redirected outwards, something inside the primary relationships gets a little weaker. Conversations become shallower, connections become thinner, the relationship starts to feel colder. It's like trying to heat up two rooms with one small fire. Neither one gets warm enough. And the real danger is, it prevents repairs. Because healthy relationships don't stay strong by avoiding tension. They stay strong by working through it, by having the comfortable conversations, and by rebuilding connections after their conflicts. But if one partner has a back door and emotional escape routes, then they never fully invest in fixing what's broken. I mean, why would they, when they're already getting part of what they need from somewhere else? Shifting the perspective for a second to the person in the receiving end of all of this, they don't usually see everything clearly. They just feel something isn't right. The hardest part about this is that there's never enough concrete evidence to point to, only fragments and moments of inconsistencies. Fortunately and unfortunately, the human brain is incredibly good at pattern detection. It's designed to pick up on subtle changes in behavior, especially in close relationships. So even when nothing is explicitly wrong, the system starts flagging risk. And that's where anxiety creeps in. Not obvious, just a nudging sense that something isn't stable. With time, that uncertainty becomes exhausting, because you're not just questioning your partner anymore, you start questioning yourself. Am I overreacting? Am I imagining this? That's the hidden damage. It's not just the loss of trust in them, it's the erosion of trust in your own perception. And at the center of all this is something surprisingly simple. It's the secrecy, not even the act itself, but the decision to hide it, to minimize it, and to keep it just out of reach. Because the moment something has to be concealed, the relationship splits into two realities. One where everything seems normal, and another where certain truths are quietly managed, filtered, or removed. Psychologically, this creates what is called asymmetry. One person has full access to what's real, the other is operating on a limited version of it. And relationships can't stay stable for that long, because trust doesn't rely just on honesty, it relies on shared realities. And once that reality starts to fracture, even in small ways, the connection begins to feel less like something solid and more like something you're consistently trying to hold together without fully understanding why it keeps slipping. And this is where most people get it wrong. They keep looking for the one big moment that explains everything. But the truth is, by the time you're done searching for that big moment, the damage has already been happening for a long time. And that's exactly what the modern environment quietly takes advantage of. Because the rules haven't just changed, they become blurry. There was a time when crossing a line in relationship was obvious. It had a weight. It had a visibility. You could point out and say, that's where something went wrong. But now, most of these lines are inside screens. They're inside the private messages, inside interactions that leave no trace unless you're actively looking for them. And when something becomes less visible, it starts to feel less real. Think about how easy it now is to maintain connections that exist in this strange in-between space, with just our phones and just enough tension to keep it interesting. A comment under a photo, a reply to a story, a message that starts as casual but lingers just a little longer than it should. None of this feels serious on its own, because modern relationships aren't just dealing with temptations anymore, they're dealing with access. the constant low-effort access to alternative attention. You don't have to go looking for it. It finds you. And something is always available. It slowly reshapes what feels normal. So behaviors that should have once felt questionable now feel like a routine. It becomes psychologically dangerous because the environment makes it easy to disconnect actions from consequences. Because there is no physical presence, it feels like no visible boundary is being crossed, just a screen and a quiet assumption that this doesn't really count. But your brain doesn't work that way. Emotionally, the impact is still real because what matters isn't where the interaction happens, it's what it represents, which is the attention, the intimacy, and the energy, which ends up in a change inside the person at the receiving end once this intimacy becomes shared somewhere else. Now, inside these shifts, there's another layer that makes this even harder to navigate, which is the ambiguity of the whole situation. Because micro-cheating doesn't operate in clear validation, it operates in gray areas. Imagine confronting someone about something that feels off. You don't have the certainty, only just a feeling. And instead of clarity, you get logic. Example, nah, nothing happened. There's no proof. You're reading too much into it. And technically, they are not wrong, and that's what makes this so disorienting. Because the absence of proof gets used as a proof of innocence. And slowly, your emotional reaction starts to feel like the problem of the relationship, rather than the actual behavior itself. This is what you could call the ambiguity play, where the lack of hard boundary becomes a tool. This can undoubtedly lead to internal wear down, not all at once, but little by little, you begin to slip into a dark place. You start bringing things up, you second guess your instincts, you start filtering your own thoughts before you even say them out loud. Because it's exhausting to feel something and constantly be told that what you're feeling doesn't make sense. This ends up leading into cognitive erosion. It may be subtle, but believe me when I say it's very, very powerful. You're not just losing trust in a relationship, but you're losing trust in your own perception of reality. Now, from the side of the person engaging in these behaviors, isn't usually thinking, I'm doing something harmful. In fact, most of the time, they're doing the opposite. They're protecting the image of themselves. So the behavior gets reframed. It's just chatting. It doesn't mean anything. I'm not actually doing anything wrong. And psychologically, this is a form of moral minimization. It's the mind's way of reducing discomfort. Instead of changing the behavior, it changes the definition of the behavior. Because as long as it doesn't fit the label of cheating, it doesn't threaten the identity as a loyal partner. But relationship doesn't operate on labels. It operates on impacts, and that impact accumulates until you start to see what's really happening, not as isolated moments, but as a compressed gigantic impact. Because whether we like it or not, trust behaves like a limited resource. Every honest conversation, every moment of transparency, every time someone chooses openness over secrecy, there's a deposit, there's something that strengthens the system. But for every hidden message, every deleted interaction, every moment where something is concealed instead of shared, that's something that breaks the system. The part that most people underestimate is that it's not about the size of the withdrawal that matters the most. It's the frequency. Imagine a relationship like a financial account. At the beginning, it's full. There's margin, there's flexibility, you can make mistakes, and it still holds. Small charges start appearing, nothing alarming, just little things, likened to the little secret habits you're doing. Individually, they don't seem that much, but over time, they add up. You can drain something slowly without making a single large move. And one day, something happens. Maybe it's a message your partner finally sees. And suddenly, it feels like everything collapsed at once. But it didn't. Your account was already empty. You're just now noticing the balance. This is what you could think of as relationship bankruptcy. Not caused by one moment, but by cumulative micro damage and small repeated disruptions that slowly destabilizes the foundation. At that point, something fundamental changes in the dynamic. You stop relating to each other as partners, and you start relating as investigators. And once a relationship shifts from connection to surveillance, it's already operating on borrowed time. Because trust isn't just about honesty, it's about ease, the ability to exist without constantly scanning of what might be wrong. Now imagine living inside this state every day for months or even years. That's the experience of the partner on the other side of micro-cheating. Micro-cheating doesn't just stay micro, it changes shape gradually. Because every time a boundary is approached and nothing happens, the brain adjusts, it recalibrates what feels acceptable, which will eventually lead to desensitization. Before anyone realizes what is happening, Something that started as harmless has quietly evolved into something much more significant. This is not just because there was a decision to betray, but because there was never a moment where the line was clearly enforced. No boundaries to solidify what's acceptable and what's not in a relationship. People don't usually jump into major betrayal. They slide into it with one small shift at a time until they're somewhere they never planned to be, but also never really stop themselves from reaching. And by then, the question is no longer, did something happen? It becomes, when did this stop being so small? Sadly, this is the case of so many relationships. And if this is clearly the state of your relationship as the micro-cheating partner, your question should shift from how did we get here to how can this be repaired? Because rebuilding trust isn't just about saying the right words. It's not about just one deep conversation, one emotional apology, or one promise that it wouldn't happen again. Those moments might feel powerful, but just in a moment. And trust doesn't respond to intensity. It responds to consistency. Think about it like this. If something was slowly drained over time, you can't just refill it at once. You don't fix a leak by pouring more water into the system. You fix the leak and then you rebuild slowly, patiently, and with repeated proof that the system can hold again. That's what real repair looks like. It starts with something most people try to avoid: full acknowledgement, not partial or defensive, not wrapped in explanation, just a clear recognition of what has been done and how it actually feels on the other side. You need to drop your selfishness and put yourself in your partner's shoes and ask yourself this: if my partner did this, how would I feel? Because without that clarity, everything else becomes just a performance. From here, the behavior becomes the only language that matters. This is where something like a behavioral audit comes in. Do not do it in a transactional or carefree way, but in an honest one. A moment where both people stop talking about intention and start looking at behavior, because intentions are invisible, but behavior isn't. So the first real shift is transparency, and not the kind that feels forced or monitored, but the kind that removes the need to hide in the first place. If something has to be concealed to keep the peace, then the peace is already artificial. The hard but necessary truth is that you're not protecting the relationship, you're just protecting your ability to continue the behavior without consequences. From there, the dynamic has to evolve, not into strict rules, but into clear agreements. Because rules create resistance, they feel like control, but agreements, those are chosen. So instead of "you're not allowed to do this," it becomes "this is what my trust is required to exist." And that changes everything, because now it's not just about interaction, it's about alignment. Two people deciding consciously what kind of relationship they're actually building. There is one step that is often overlooked, and it's the one that determines whether any of this actually works, which is closing the back door, removing a safety net, the validation reserve, and a quiet option or options that existed outside the relationship. As long as these doors are open, even if it is slightly, you can't give your full investment into the relationship you're trying to fix, because part of you is still somewhere else. And relationships can feel that, even if nothing is said. So rebuilding trust isn't about fixing what's broken. It's about removing conditions that allowed it to break in the first place. If done right, the check-in slows down, the conversations feels less guarded, not because everything is perfect again, but because consistency starts to replace uncertainty. That is what trust is at its core. It's predictability, the quiet confidence that what you see is actually there. Here comes the part that matters just as much as the repair. It's prevention. Because the strongest relationships aren't the ones that never face temptations. They are the ones that don't need to hide from it. When a relationship is emotionally active, when both people feel seen, valued, and connected, the pool of external validation loses its intensity. Not completely, but just enough that it doesn't take over, simply because you're not searching for something you already have. This is why small, consistent movement matter more than grand gestures. Checking in, being present, not just physically, but emotionally, creates a space where both people can bring discomfort, insecurities, even attraction to others without fear of judgment or shutdown. Because once something can be talked about openly, it loses power to exist in secrecy. Because secrecy is where all of this begins. The goal isn't perfection, it's awareness. It's building a relationship where nothing important has to live in the shadows. Relationships usually don't end because of one big failure. They end because of the small fractures that were ignored until they become impossible to repair. In the end, loyalty isn't the absence of a big mistake, is the presence of clarity in almost every small moment, because without connection, there is no logic to staying. And when connection starts to fade, people may not always leave immediately, but something inside the relationship already left. So if there's one thing to take from all of this, it's this. Trust is fragile in a very specific way, not because it breaks easily, but because it erodes quietly. And once it's gone, rebuilding is possible, but it will never feel the same as something that was protected from the beginning. Trust is like a mirror. You can piece it back together, you can hold it up again, but the cracks will always be there, simply changing the way everything is reflected. Which means the most logical way to protect a relationship isn't by waiting for the moment when everything falls apart, but by actively making the choice not to let micro-cheating survive inside a relationship. If this is something you found insightful, please give this video a thumbs up and subscribe to this channel for more relationship psychology content. Turn on post notifications so you don't miss our posts. And please feel free to share with someone in need. Thanks for watching. Bye.